Hey everybody, it's Professor Diffley, History 110, Unit 5, Part 4 for the Unit 5 lectures. Alright, we just finished off with the balance of power. Again, clearly it looks like the British have the advantage in most material ways here. Again, this is how the colonists are depicted by the British here, right? A ragtag group not to be taken seriously. Another part of this, African Americans played a huge role in the revolution, significant role. Over 5,000 African Americans enlisted in the army, militia. Some were slaves who were promised their freedom, and some as substitutes for the master or their sons. But it's very important to note, even though technically African Americans weren't allowed into the Continental Army, at least that's what the rules said, they did serve. They fought, African American and white soldiers fought side by side in the Revolution. It's really important because that's not going to happen again until the Korean War in the 1950s. So it's going to be almost 200 years again until African Americans and whites fight in integrated armies rather than segregated armies. But they did play a significant role. Again, as I just said, that hundreds of African Americans, particularly slaves, found freedom and opportunity by enlisting in the British. Though in many ways, the British seem to offer more freedom, opportunities for freedom than African Americans. Again, only if you served, you might be promised your freedom. But the British were willing to free all these slaves as part to hurt the colonists, but also to really to hurt the colonists, but also give them the chance of freedom. And you see even some of Washington's slaves fled to British lines and joined the fight against the Americans here. But that is an important note here. The early war, again, first years of the war does not go well for the colonists. British capture New York and push the Americans back through Jersey. This is important because New York is sort of separates New England with the rest of the East Coast colony. So if you control New York, you kind of have the colonists separated there. They do push them out of New York, the colonists, and this is the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, the escape across the frozen Delaware River to Jersey, escaping there, where they eventually encamp at Valley Forge. This nearly broke the Continental Army. Freezing conditions, you have lots of deserters, they have little to no supplies, while the British control Philadelphia and New York. While the colonists, the Continental Army soldiers are freezing, some of them freezing to death out in the wilderness here at Valley Forge, the British are having, celebrations, balls, parties in New York and Philly. So it's a very, a stark differences between how each side is going. Now, one of the important turning points, because at this point the British are really winning at every turn, is victories at Trenton and Princeton in Jersey. Washington saved this army by the surprise attacks at New Jersey. Again, a lot of soldiers are just walking away, they're demoralized. And Trenton in 1776 in December, and in Princeton in 1777. These are minor battles, but they're victories, and that gives people hope, is really what it does. They take out some of the Hessians, they capture other towns, so this is a turning point. Real turning point in the war, though. It's the beginning of turning point, the battles of Princeton and Trenton. Here, the Battle of Saratoga, the real turning point. Why? This is going to convince European powers like France and Spain to join the American colonists' cause here. In October of 1777, the British Army, a second British army coming down from the south, trying to link up with the main forces of the British to increase their size, gets isolated in New England and New York, it's in New York, and surrounded, defeated, and forced to surrender at Saratoga, also upstate New York. Major turning point, right? They not only defeat them, but they capture and take off the field an entire British army. Again, turning point, helped the French, persuade the French to recognize the United States as an independent country and supply it with military assistance. Why is French assistance so big here? They're going to send soldiers, they're going to send arms, they're going to send money, they're going to send officers to train them, but really importantly, their navy. Now the Americans have some sort of naval force at their disposal. The French is under French command, but it can counter the British later when the Spanish get involved too. Now you have the French and Spanish navies combined can match the British there. And again, European assistance is key in all of this. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams are ambassadors. They go to France and to the Dutch and the Spanish to get assistance. Really important man picture here on the right is a young Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was key in winning this. He becomes one of Washington's top lieutenants, top commanders, helps train the soldiers. He's even going to be the one that pushes Washington at the final defeat of the British at Yorktown. It seems Washington was a little hesitant, but Lafayette pushes them forwards. And then you got France, Spain, and the Dutch mostly giving money to the cause, now all allied against the British. So in some ways, this is turning into a world war, right? There's going to be skirmishes in Europe, on the seas around the world, between all the major powers here. One thing, just back to Lafayette, incredibly important. He comes and revisits the United States later. He is given a hero's welcome. There are Lafayette Squares and Lafayette Boulevards, all of this, all around America. As a result, Lafayette will also play a major role in organizing French citizens into their national guard during the later French Revolution here. Even though he's a Marquis, which is a nobleman, he still fights for the American cause here. Here's some more battles you can see here of the during the war. Here is the British taking New York. The late war, it's now in the South, is where we're going to focus. This is a irregular warfare, sort of guerrilla combat, right? It's instead of lining up in a field, they're going to hit and run attacks on the British, really try to hurt them as much as possible. This is a brutal civil war in much of these parts down there between loyalists, those staying with the British crown, and the colonists. Again, atrocities, murders on each side. But it did not crush the rebellion in the South. This is a huge area, something that the North will have an issue with, too, in the civil wars. It's a major, major area to try to control it, defeat it, occupy it, all that. But brutal treatment by the British against civilians, especially Bannister Street Tarleton, the colonel, it actually pushed more and more Americans to colonists to join the rebellion. They're trying this brutal treatment of civilians is meant to crush the American spirit, but it actually energizes the people. Again, often when you go after non-combatants, their families, that will just energize more to want to fight against you. Again, not everything's going great. 1780, Congress is bankrupt. The army's without pay. There's mutinies. More and more loyalists are flocking to the British with their slaves and starting fighting. Essentially, it's a civil war, as I mentioned before. But you see these different foot soldiers here at Yorktown. Just shows you see African Americans. You see, all the different people involved in this later. But the Battle of Yorktown really ends the war. Yorktown is a peninsula. And here, let's get to it. Yeah, they're fighting the major army of the British, led by Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis was very sure of himself, a veteran of the British military, very successful. He had already been promised large parts of the Americans, and he began to draw up plans of what he was going to do with all his property once he crushed the Americans. But what happens is they are trapped. Cornwallis and his army is trapped on the peninsula at Yorktown. A peninsula is a body of land surrounded by water at three sides. They pull back to this area. They set up fortifications there. It is there where Lafayette and Washington charge in to cut off their escape. Now, the British can only go out to the water. Again, they have a powerful military, but this is when the French assistance really pays off. The French naval fleet shows up and now can bombard the British fortifications from the sea. The Americans and their French allies have them surrounded on the land, and so they eventually surrender. Cornwallis is not a good loser, let's put it that way. It's customary for the commanders to come out and meet. When the British surrender here, Cornwallis will not even come out to see the Americans. This is his incredible low point for him. But October 17th, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown defeats the British Army in the colonies. At this point, what you got, though, and here's another picture of it there. Here's another depiction. You see the French Navy coming on from the outside. and the British and the American, forces here. Now, why is this important? Look, the British could have kept fighting. They're much larger in terms of army and money and that, but many in the Britain began to lose interest in this war. It was costing them a lot of money. It was viewed as, what's this really fighting for here? Is it really worth it to keep these colonies? By this point, Britain's beginning to turn its attention more and more towards India and other places. In fact, in many ways, the British Empire becomes more powerful after its loss to the American colonies than it did beforehand, before this war, which eventually is the Treaty of Paris, which defeats, ends the war. Again, you see the public support just collapses. They thought the other parts were much more valuable, and hey, why not just trade with the Americans anyway? Treaty of Paris, 1783, Britain recognized America's independence, ceded the entire area between Canada and Florida, east of the Mississippi River, giving the first part of America there. And here's a map that shows you Louisiana is now owned by the French. You have over here, Louisiana. Here's the United States. Here's British North America. This is land disputed by Spain, England, and Russia over there. You see the Spanish territories over here. But again, the war is now over. Again, here's Cornwallis's defeat. The war is over. The Americans had won it. It is a turning point again. And what we're going to look at next in the next unit is now what happened. So this was mostly about the politics and the battles, the military aspect. Now we're going to look at what happens in the next unit to regular people. What does the revolution mean to them? Again, large numbers of Americans were not for the war. Many are going to leave, go up to Canada. There's going to be so many loyalists looking ahead that leave America. That the Canadians, British and Canada, have to create a new province of New Brunswick, Canada, to house all of these American colonists who want out, don't want anything to do with the new United States. But again, make sure you take a look at the videos, read the notes to these slides, and let me know if you have questions. All right, folks, good luck.